and his Communist Viet Minh Party in North Vietnam, and continued against the backdrop of an intense Cold War between two global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. More than 3 million people, including 58,000 plus Americans, were killed in the Vietnam War. More than half were Vietnamese civilians. By 1969, at the peak of the U.S. involvement in the war, there were more than 500,000 U.S. military personnel were involved in the Vietnam conflict. Growing opposition to the war in the United States led to bitter divisions among Americans, both before and after President Richard Nixon ordered the withdrawal of U.S. forces in 1973. In 1975, Communist forces seized control of Saigon, ending the Vietnam War, and the country was unified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam the following year. Now there's quite a gap in between the 1950s through the 1970s. When I was in high school here in Big Piney, my senior year, you have to remember that we didn't have 24-hour news coverage of anything that was happening at that time. We knew just exactly what came over the news at 5 o'clock at night. And that was actually, come to find out, it was censored. ABC, CBS, and NBC were the three principal news agencies, and they were told what they could say about it after we found out what was going on. The government kept a whole lot of things from all of us. And as a senior in high school at that time, we didn't really care much either. We were more concerned about what we were going to do after school, and things didn't really affect us here. Not nearly like the other big cities in the United States, who were having even problems at that time with the war and the things that were going on. In 1955, one of our ships was fired on in the Gulf of Tonkin. And preceding that, well, that was 1964, I'm sorry. And quickly, the U.S. fighter pilots wiped out one of the Vietnamese boats and disabled two of the other that attacked us in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is actually commonly known as when the whole conflict, or we became really involved. In 1964, Congress passed an act called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. That gave President Lyndon Johnson at that time power to do whatever he wanted to do. And also it kept the Congress from having to declare war and putting their name out in public that they were behind the war. So they just passed this resolution, and Lyndon Johnson decided what was going to happen. At that time, he put 4,000 Green Berets into Vietnam as advisors. They weren't to fight. If they were fired upon, they couldn't fire back. They were to call in and tell them that they had problems, and the South Vietnamese army that they were training were the only ones that could go back at them. During that time, of course, the war escalated, and Lyndon Johnson decided the best way to help our troops was to bring in the B-52 bombers and bomb Hanoi, bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was the actual route that the Viet Cong were using to get their supplies down into South Vietnam. Now, the election of 1964, and I'm going to backtrack here just a little bit, pitted Barry Goldwater against Lyndon Johnson. Barry Goldwater's idea of how to fight the Vietnam War was to not commit any troops, to just bomb the hell out of them. That's what he advocated, and Lyndon Johnson advocated a more political solution to the problems over there. And what it was all over was communist aggression by Russia and China to influence the people of South Vietnam. That was because the leaders of South Vietnam at that time were Catholics. John F. Kennedy was a Catholic, and he was assassinated in 1963, so Lyndon Johnson took over. He was the vice president and took over after John Kennedy was assassinated. And there's quite a group of people that feel that because the Diem regime over in Vietnam were Catholic, the majority of the country was Buddhist, and they felt that there was an internal uprising going on in Vietnam as well as over here. So Lyndon Johnson wanted a political solution to, in my estimation. let's put it that way. Barry Goldwater scared every mother in the United States of America whose sons they thought were going to have to fight this war. He really scared them with this bombing deal. They liked the way Lyndon Johnson talked, so naturally he was elected. My mother, for example, was very concerned about, she wouldn't vote for Barry Goldwater on a bet. Now my dad, who was a World War II veteran, had a different idea about it. He felt, you know, you take your big dog to the fight any time, because there's no sense messing around with them. My dad's philosophy was, if you don't hate who you're fighting against and love who you're fighting for, stay out of it. Lyndon Johnson got elected and started the bombing. It wasn't working. So that's when they started the big buildup. In 1965, I went to college at Utah State. And in 1966, I ran out of money. My dad says, stay in, I'll pay your way. I didn't feel like right then that I was doing a heck of a lot of good in college, and decided to drop out and make my own money, because I had a couple sisters that Dad was going to have to pay for to go to college, and he was going to be strapped. So I dropped out of college. Within probably 2 weeks, I got a draft notice from the draft board here in Sublette County. It said, greetings. Your friends and neighbors have selected you to represent them in the armed forces of the United States of America. And it gave me the date of when I was to appear, to show up, and they loaded us up on the Sublette stage lines in Pinedale, went to Rock Springs on the Zanetti bus lines, and down to Fort Douglas in Salt Lake City. And run us all through the preliminary physical. There wasn't any coming home after that. They loaded us on an airplane that night at 10 o'clock and flew us to Fort Bliss, Texas. The next day, I started basic training in Fort Bliss, Texas. A lot of basic training is physical training. Now, this is before anybody had any rights. And by rights, what I mean is the ACLU hadn't got involved in protecting individual rights from the government and from the establishment. Basic training was a pretty rough time. You towed the mark. After 8 weeks of basic training, I don't believe that there was anybody that made it through. There were those who phased back and phased out of basic training because they couldn't hack the physical part or the mental part. They tried to get in your head just as bad as they tried to get to your body. But after you came out of basic training, everybody there was 10 foot tall and bulletproof. And I mean to tell you now, you were strutting around just like a peacock because you felt you had really achieved something. After basic training, they, of course, during basic, they give you an aptitude test on where your general abilities lie. Mine happened to be in electronics. I don't know how to this day because I've never been associated with much of it, but they said, we're going to put you in a cryptographic school. Now, cryptographics is a coding and decoding messages. They sent me to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and went through a basic teletype school. During that time, they were running a security check on me. I had to have a top secret clearance to go into what they called the cage, which was to take on this coding and decoding machinery that they had over there that they put in helicopters and ground troops. They had a KY-8 that they carried ground troops, and what this KY-8 did was it had a patch code, and every day they sent down a new patch code that you had to match that patch code before you could receive any messages from the sender to the receiver. They both had to be patched the same way, and that's the way they communicated so that there was no breach of any information to the enemy. The same with the KW-7, which was on helicopters. When they called in, as soon as your voice left that machine, it was scrambled, garbled, all the way to whoever you were sending it to, and if they had the right patch code in their machine, it came back out just as if you were talking to them. Well, this was a top secret patch code and a top secret, you had to have a top secret clearance in order to get the information, in order to be able to understand how the cryptographic machines work. They had phases. There was 20 of us in each phase. When I finally got my clearance, and mine was one of the first clearances to come through because it was easy for them to find out. I was born and raised in Big Piney, Wyoming. It was easy for them to find out that and pass me through on a top secret clearance. But I have to say, you've all heard the controversies now about top secret messages, emails, Hillary's email, and all this kind of stuff that came through as top secret. Top secret to us meant that if you had the need to know, that's the only way that you received any kind of a message. Otherwise, you didn't receive all top secret messages. You just received the need to know messages that were going through there. That separates the men from the boys, actually, because we didn't really know anything other than a little bit about where A Company was up in down in the Delta, or up at Phu Bai, or something like that over in Vietnam. After that school, there was 3 of us that made it through the first phase of this cryptographic school. There was 2 electrical engineers that had recently graduated from college that just got drafted, and me. And naturally, I was the 3rd one. One of them got picked to go to Italy. One got picked to go to Germany. And I got picked to go to Vietnam. Wasn't a real happy day, but no big deal. I felt then, I was pretty patriotic at that time, you know. I had finished basic training, I had finished AIT, and was thrilled to be part of what I felt was a brotherhood of soldiers. I got on the airplane in Oakland Air Base. I had to get to Oakland Air Base after I left Fort Bliss, Texas. And walked in there and gave them my papers. And they said, you go over to this billet over here. And I walked in, and it was a great big auditorium full of GIs, full of Army guys, and cots. That's all there was cots and Army people. And when I walked through the door, they locked it. You couldn't get out. Right then I started wondering just what was going to take place, and I got to talking to some of the guys, and they said they've had so many bolt and run out of here that once you get in here and put your paperwork in, they won't let you out. You're going on the plane. They marched you in formation right to the plane and loaded you up. We took off about 11 o'clock at night, flew to Yokota, Japan, lit, refueled. There was 127 of us on that plane, and then flew on to Ton Son Nhut Air Base, which was just right outside of Saigon. Before we deplaned, the pilot came on and said, they're shelling the airport at Ton Son Nhut right now. We have to wait. We will circle until we can't anymore before we land. And you could see the mortars going off on the air base and the landing strip out there. Well, we finally took it down, and they lit. The pilot come marching down the aisle. They were the first ones to deplane. And to my amazement, my next door neighbor was the pilot of the plane that flew me over. I don't know whether any of you you probably recognize the name Truman Miley. If you don't recognize the name, maybe you would of Rocky Piernick. I was his stepdad. But they lived right across the street from me over here in Big Piney. And he took one look at me and said, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm supposed to be here. What are you doing here? He was flying for Flying Tiger Airlines. He was a pilot, and just so happened that he was the pilot that took me over there. So I asked him if he would please report to my mother that I got there. She was terribly worried, and in those days you didn't make a phone call home. There wasn't any way, there wasn't any satellite communication or anything like that. The military, for the most part, communicated by teletype, which was the KW-7, which was the security gear back and forth to the United States. It wasn't like it is now. The communication wasn't there. I never did. There was a couple guys that got to send some messages over at the last part of my tour over there. But otherwise, you didn't communicate with anybody except writing letters. And of course, that's the first thing that they wanted you to do when you got to in country, was to write a letter. Well, what an eye-opener. We deplaned there, and all of a sudden somebody said hit the dirt, and we laid out on that runway for 2 hours. I was in my dress khakis, and I laid on that runway, and at 120 degrees, the pavement is real soft and real sticky, and the whole front of my khakis were black from the runway. I had footprints that was sinking into the runway that deep, getting out of there. I only weighed a couple 100 pounds then. But anyway, we got there, and they took us to a replacement camp at Long Bend, which was about 10 or 12 miles out of Thompson Air Base, and that's where they would collect all the incoming troops, and then they would wait till your assignment came to get you. Most of the guys were going into different infantry units, but I had my orders said that I was to go to the 69th Signal Battalion. I waited about a week, and the details while you were there weren't that pleasant. I'll never, ever forget the smell of Vietnam. They had latrines there, and every day while you were waiting for your duty station, you got to go out and burn the remains of the latrines over there and move the latrines just one notch over and dig a new hole. So that smell lingered all the time you were over there. Finally, a colonel came out and asked me who I was and told me to get in the Jeep. I grabbed my stuff and away we went. I was in the 69th Signal Battalion, but I was assigned to the 706 Signal Detachment, which supported the 5th Special Forces Group of the Green Berets over there. He took me directly to a PX, and we drove up and down the parking lot, all the military Jeeps that were parked there, and he finally came up on one with the keys in it, and he said, "Get in that Jeep and follow me." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yes, get in that Jeep and follow me." So I got in that Jeep and started it up, and away we went. We got out to this 706 Signal Detachment, and they had a Quonset hut. And he said, "Pull that Jeep in there." I did. And two of the guys came out and they had stencils, and they stenciled 706 Signal Detachment on that Jeep. And he says, "That's your transportation for the time that you're going to be in Vietnam." Somebody was without a Jeep, and I had one. Every time we had an inspection over there, we had to go hide that Jeep somewhere so it didn't show up. What I'm getting at is the irreverent acts that went on over in Vietnam. You've probably seen some episodes of MASH, some of that kind of stuff. Well, that was the Korean War. This was Vietnam, and it was way, way different in Vietnam, because in other cities besides Big Piney, Wyoming, they were already protesting the Vietnam War. None of them wanted, nobody that I knew of over there wanted to be there. And consequently, there were 30,000 dishonorable discharges over in Vietnam that they flew out of the country, put in the Long Bin jail until they could fly them out of the country. 30,000 deserters over there that they caught. There's still 1,700 MIAs, or missing in action over there. You've probably seen our POW-MIA flag at some of our Legion ceremonies. It's the black flag with the hands tied together or clasped together. Some of those were missing in action somewhere. A good share of them, and I know several, that just walked off the base and blended into the society over there, and as far as I know, they're still there. They didn't want anything to do with this country. There were 1,700 draft card burners that went to Canada at that time. 1,700 wouldn't go to Vietnam, they went to Canada instead. The only real problem I had with those guys that went to Canada was that in 1975, they invited them all back as heroes into the United States. My philosophy was that if they wanted to go to Canada that bad, they should have had to stay there. Of course, now, all during my tour in Vietnam, I was an advisor to the ARVNs, which was the Army of Vietnam. And I dealt mostly with the Vietnamese as far as their communications, their cryptographics went. We gave them our older equipment, naturally. We didn't give them any of the new stuff. And so I maintained, as well as distributed and accounted for all the cryptographic gear that was given to the ARVNs from, I went over there in 1967, and I got out in the first part of 1969. Now during that time, the reason why I was over there that long, I was over there 26.5 months. They captured the Pueblo, which was the North Vietnamese, or actually it was in conjunction with the North Koreans, captured the Pueblo, and on the Pueblo, which was a USS Navy ship, were all of the communications gear that I worked on in Vietnam. And that was in 1968. Consequently, that was in January of 1968, consequently they called me in and said, congratulations, you just won yourself another tour in Vietnam. Because I was scheduled to go home at that time, but that had compromised all the security gear that I worked on over there. All the top secret gear was compromised because the communists had a piece of each one of the gear that I worked on. So they commissioned a team of engineers from Texas Instruments came over, and they had been working on new gear to replace what we had over there anyway. So I was the only one in the country at that time with my top secret clearance to take on this new gear. That's the reason why I had to stay over there another tour. Now, my responsibilities were that I was in charge of accounting, distribution, and maintenance of this new gear. We only had about 100 pieces of gear in the country at that time, this new gear. I was responsible to, if a helicopter got shot down with one of the pieces of security gear on there, I was responsible to go out with a team of Green Berets and my little Vietnamese interpreter, who I'm sure if we ever got in a real bad bind, he was gonna shoot me first. I watched him very closely. But when we went out, when there was a helicopter shot down or somebody dropped a piece of gear when they were being evacuated, our responsibility was to go out and find that piece of gear. Either get the name tag off of it and blow that piece of gear up, or bring it back, one or the other. And we spent some real scary times getting that stuff out of there. I saw some atrocities that are certainly unspeakable to anybody. I don't think I've ever spoke about them. You know, you hear about waterboarding, you hear about torture, what we do when we capture the enemy, whatever, and how the rules are with us torturing somebody. Let me tell you, there are no rules that applied in Vietnam. No rules at all as far as the enemy towards us. You've probably heard Senator John McCain from Arizona. He was a POW in Hanoi, at the Hanoi Hill. And some of the things that they did to him, that was mild compared to some of the pilots and some of the guys that I found in downed helicopters. Don't talk to me about torture, because as far as I'm concerned, like I told you, my dad's philosophy about the war, when there's a war, you're in it to win it. If not, don't be in it. Anyway, I would either blow that piece of security gear up or pack it out of there, one or the other, because I was to account for it. Now, I was supposed to bring back the name tag, but there was a lot of times when I didn't want to get all that close to that name tag, because they were waiting for somebody to come out and pick up the remains of that helicopter and the people who were in it. Consequently, it was much easier to lob a grenade in there and make sure it was blowing up and tell them that piece of gear is gone and I know where, you know, and I would sign off on that piece of gear, because there wasn't any way that you would get in and out alive in a situation like that. It was, I mean, it was an ambush deluxe waiting to happen. My Vietnamese interpreter could tell me, and he would tell me, just exactly what was going on there. He knew. He could tell whether it was an ambush or whether it was safe to go in or whatever. How he knew, I'll never know. He had an intuition about him that was remarkable. And he was a good guy. He, you know, a friend. But as far as I wanted to trust him anyway, he was a good friend. When I got to the end of my extended tour over there, I was already out of the Army 3 days before they ever flew in to get me out of the jungle in Vietnam. So my ETS, which is estimated time of service, was already over, and I was still in Vietnam in uniform. They flew in and picked me up and said, "You're going in." And I said, "Well, I've still got one more piece of gear to find." And they said, "No, you're not going in, you're going home. We've got a replacement for you. So, yippee, I went in and they discharged me and loaded me on the plane the next, or they mustered me out of Vietnam and loaded me on a plane, flew me to Oakland Air Base where I was to be discharged. When we deplaned there was a whole line of shaggy-looking hippie lizards lined the whole area. And there was an MP in front of every one of them. And that MP was to protect the protesters rather than us. And they were spitting on us, they were throwing signs at us, they were doing everything you can imagine that they could get away with, and the MPs wouldn't do anything to them, but they were on us, making us stay in line but protecting the protesters. Well, they finally got us into the building, and lo and behold, it was the 29th of December. When we got in there, there was a skeleton crew to discharge us. Everybody over here was home on leave for the Christmas vacation. And here we are waiting to get discharged. And they didn't care here. The Army didn't care. All of a sudden, my BB brain started realizing that everything that I thought of the Army and patriotism and duty, honor, and country, everything like that was all of a sudden dissolving. You know, being treated like that, I just couldn't understand what was taking place. Well, they got us in the discharge hall and they put us all in bleachers. And they brought in a plane load of dishonorable discharges from Long Bin Jail and discharged them before they did us. We had to sit there and watch them, give them the dishonorable discharges before they would muster us out. As you can imagine, there was a whole, almost a riot. Some of the guys, and me especially, I'd already been out of the Army 3 days, so it didn't make very much difference to me one way or the other what they thought of me. I was already out, and I let them know that, by the way, and we had quite a discussion with several of the MPs, and they wanted to give me an Article 15 for disrupting everything that was going on, but they couldn't do that because I was already out of the Army. I had already run out of time. So I didn't get an Article 15, but they did tell me, once we got mustered out, that if you wear your uniform home, you can fly military standby. And I looked outside, and here's this line of protesters and all those MPs protesting them. And we're supposed to wear our uniform home the way the people felt about us there. And there were, I think every one of us that was on that plane went into the bathroom, changed clothes, and walked out of there in our cities. Nobody flew home, military standby. The closest I could get was Salt Lake City to home. I flew into Salt Lake, and lo and behold, the same thing was going on there. The protesters in the terminals, the airport, the long-haired, shaggy, the armband. But in that bunch, there were guys dressed in suits, ties, women protesting, big signs, and the whole bit. And I thought, what in the world has happened since I was gone? Because over in Vietnam, we didn't get any of that kind of news. We had the Armed Forces Broadcasting Network, which was, you've probably seen Good Morning America, or Good Morning Vietnam, the show with Robin Williams in it. I don't know, maybe that's before your time too, but anyway, he went over as a radio broadcaster, and we had guys like that, the Armed Forces Radio. They told us just exactly what they wanted us to know over there, and that's it. They played music most of the time. And a lot of it was protest music, you know, but we didn't know. We didn't know what they were talking about when they played Are You Going to San Francisco and all those songs that were popular in 1969. But we also had the Stars and Stripes, which was the military newspaper. Never said a word about what was going on over here. None of us knew. Well, after I got to Salt Lake, I called my sister and Linda Tanner, or Linda Garrison, but Linda Tanner, a friend of mine here in Big Piney. And they came down and got me, and I met them in Evanston. I got on the bus in Salt Lake and met them in Evanston. And I got home. It was actually New Year's Day when I finally got home here, because you gained a couple days coming back here. And I started noticing that there wasn't any of that going on here in Big Piney. I was walking back just like I was, just like it was when I left. Nobody said a word. The next day was New Year's Day, and the day after that, I decided, well, I better go make a little bit of money. I had saved quite a bit of money while I was in Vietnam, because we didn't have anywhere to spend it, really. And so I thought, well, I'll go find me a job. So my dad says El Paso's hiring, and you can work till next fall, and then you go back to school. Good idea. Well, on the way up, my friend Linda Tanner, Linda Garris, was a receptionist at Belco. And so I wanted to stop and talk to her. She was one of them with my sister that came down and got me in Evanston. And while I was talking to Linda, she was out on the front desk. George Nugent, the general manager, or the district manager, came out, and he glad-handed me, and he says, come on back, I want to talk to you. And he was a veteran himself. And so we sat and talked about almost the same thing I've just told you guys. And he finally, after about 2 hours, he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm going up to El Paso to apply for a job. He says, you got your lunch bucket with you? I said, no. He said, well, go home and get it. You got you a job. After I worked there 31 years, after that time, never did go back to school. But what I'm trying to say is, I didn't want any part of any of the rest of the country the way we were treated coming home. Big Piney treated me very well. Sublette County treated me very well. And I decided to make my home here in Big Piney and raise my family and be a part of this community, because they treated me very well. You've probably all seen pictures of some of the Vietnam veterans out on the street, homeless. That's the picture that you get now about the Vietnam veterans. Last spring, and I about forgot everything that went on. Last spring they had a Vietnam Veterans Welcome Home 50 years late over in Casper. And there were 700 of us showed up at that reunion. And out of that 700, we had several speeches, and the governor was there, the senators were there, and everybody was talking about this, that, and the other. But they broke us up into the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, and put us all in separate rooms. After they got us in there, they handed the microphone to each one of us. And we got to spill our guts on just anything that we wanted to say about Vietnam. And I got to tell you, there's still a lot of bitter guys a lot of bitter ones. There's a lot of them that have got over it. There's a lot of them that never will. PTSD was, that stands for post-stress or post. Let me rehash this. Anyway, PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. That wasn't heard of in those days. They just turned you loose out of Vietnam. There's a whole lot of guys suffer from that. Flashbacks, psychological problems that you can understand the ones with the physical, missing an arm, leg, wounds, burns, all that kind of thing. But you can't see the PTSD people, and they really hadn't heard of it. But all of a sudden, 50 years after that, they're starting to allow veterans into the VA with PTSD and all kinds of other things. In the early 1960s over in Vietnam, they dropped what they called Agent Orange. I don't know whether any of you ever heard of that, but that was a defoliant that killed all the foliage, laid it all down so that you could see the enemy, supposedly. But those little lizards had tunnels, and let me tell you, they could crawl through that stuff. They could bomb a full area and lay it down flat, and within 24 hours they were crawling out of every hole you could imagine over there. They were that sneaky. But this Agent Orange, and I believe to this day that they knew what they were doing when they dropped it. But out of the 700 that were over in that reunion, 80% of them had some sort of an affliction from Agent Orange, including diabetes, Hodgkin's disease, 25 different cancers that were caused by exposure to Agent Orange. I myself have multiple myeloma, which is a bone marrow cancer that they're treating, but some of the guys really got it bad over there, and the United States government are finally recognizing the problems that they had over there, mostly due to the Iraq War and the recognition of Desert Storm veterans that are coming back. They have awakened the whole country on veterans' plights and problems that they have coming back into society. So things are looking up all the way around. But in order to understand the attitude towards the Vietnam War, and it's still a touchy subject with all kinds of people, I hope you get the background of what I felt and how it all evolved with me. So with that, food for thought. Do you have any questions that I can answer? Ask me anything. I don't know whether I'll answer or not, but you can ask me. Sir?
Did any more people from your Piney coming to you?
Yeah, I can give you a list of them. Alan Kirkwood, Reynold Brown, Zoll Blackman, Rick Tieferteller. Let's see, who else would have been over there that? There's several that aren't around here anymore. Sammy Orr was one of them. Alan Grant that was there. One thing that I did fail to mention was when they mustered me out, they told me there was two groups of civilian military organizations that were in the country, the VFW, which you've all heard of, and the American Legion. And they said, but the American Legion at this time isn't accepting any Vietnam veterans. I said, what's the deal there? And they said, well, John Kerry. You all know who John Kerry is? He's the Secretary of State right now. He was a decorated Vietnam veteran. He was a swift boat captain over there. I happen to know him, know of him over there. He put himself in for every medal he got over there. He's the phoniest Vietnam veteran, and that's using the term lightly, that I know of. But due to his testifying before Congress, when he got back, he called us baby killers, rapists, murderers, and said that's what the whole Vietnam War was all about. He took a handful of medals and threw them over the fence that he got in Vietnam, and threw down his uniform, stomped on the flag, and right now he's the Secretary of State. I told them that the American Legion wouldn't ever have to worry about me wanting to join anyway. I didn't want nothing to do with it. A couple of years ago, well, about 5 years ago, I built the Veterans Memorial out at the cemetery. I don't know whether all of you have seen it or not, out at our cemetery out here. It has the name of every veteran from Sublette County. World War I, II, Korean War, and Vietnam, and Desert Storm, and the Iraq War. But every veteran that went from Sublette County, I put their names on that memorial out there. I was a chairman of the cemetery board then, and I needed a military group to kind of sponsor what was going on out there. Due to the Homeland Security Act, the federal government wouldn't give me the names of the Sublette County veterans to put on the list out there. I finally conned the clerk, the Sublette County clerk up in the clerk's office, to give me the names of the veterans who had applied for the veterans exemption in Sublette County. And what that means is the veterans get a certain amount of off of their tax, either their property tax or their license plates, for being a veteran. Well, I got that list, and that's the names I started with out there. I've since then put probably 30 to 100 names a year on people that weren't registered out there. But the only military group that we had in Big Piney was, guess what? The American Legion. And I asked them to sponsor or help me with that Veterans Memorial out there. To sponsor it, I would get it built, and I already had it built. And they said, only if you'll join the American Legion. And the moral of the story is, if you're going to eat crow, eat it while it's hot, because it don't taste good when it's cold. But I joined, and now I'm the commander of the American Legion here. And our main purpose, or my main purpose in that, is there'll never be another veteran from Sublette County that will ever be invited back the way we were. Nor will there ever be a veteran that doesn't have military honors when they're buried in our cemetery out there. So that's kind of where it stands now. I don't know. That's all the names that I can think of right now that were in Vietnam. But that certainly give you idea who to contact. I don't know whether you know any of them. But, they were all over there about the same time I was.
And if you're okay with it, I think what we might do is if we pause and go take a break so you guys can get a drink and think of some questions and maybe talk amongst yourselves in the hallway. And then we can come back and give you a chance to get a drink and stuff too, and then we'll ask some questions. I have a ton, but I'll let you guys ask them first. Okay, so let's go take a break first. Don't loiter, because Mr. Nichols' time is not gonna be wasted on our account.
Not very important, but I hope